Oi, oi, it's your boy, the Rick Story of Been in the Tories, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you on Monday, the 8th of July, following a weekend with no UFC, except for when the UFC fighters, or the washed UFC fighters, did the boxing. But I didn't pay to watch that, so I'm not going to review that. There was a one event that had some interesting stuff on. There was a great K1 event that I just got done watching this morning. If you haven't watched that, go watch Yuki Yoza smash Kong Napa. Because you know I'm always going to tell you to watch Yuki Yoza anyway. But I'll talk about that and Tai Ruotolo versus Joseph Chen and all the niche stuff. I'll do that on the Boycast, but it was really fun. But today, to get people in who don't want to hear about Tai Ruotolo and Joseph Chen having a grappling match where they reconnaissanced for their $1 million tournament match later this month or next month or whenever the Craig Jones Invitational is, for people who don't froth at the crotch when I mention competitive grappling, we're going to be talking about, well, whatever you guys want to talk about. I've put up a question thread on Twitter. I haven't really looked at it. It could be full of abuse. But I'll be looking at it now, and we'll be talking about various topics that are burning in the minds of MMA fans on this weekend without any UFC. All right, here we go. Already a question that I can use as the headline for the pod. Lewis says, where do you rank Alex in the GOAT conversation? My brothers and I regularly get into discussions about it. I don't think he ranks as highly because of his resume, but would love to hear your thoughts on it. Love the work, Slacky. This one's tricky, and I'm gonna have a good go at good faith chat about it rather than just saying he's never had to defend a double from someone who can shoot a double. He's one of those ones where I look at it and I go, that's a really impressive record with an asterisk. Someone like Henry Cejudo is a great example. I think we used to talk about him quite a lot for this because there's no way that you can look at it that beating Demetrius Johnson at the height of his powers, then knocking out TJ Dillashaw at the height of his powers, then Marlon Moraes on an incredible streak, and then Dominic Cruz, just filling out the legend quotient and retiring. You can't look at those four performances and not be like, that's really impressive. But you can look at those performances and say, there was always something about it that was a little bit, takes the shine off it. So the Demetrius Johnson one is obviously that he won quite a close split decision, and a lot of people thought Demetrius Johnson won. Now, taking Demetrius Johnson to a close split decision that is either way is still, you're a pretty bloody great fighter, because no one else has done that. But that's, asterisk number one. TJ Dillashaw, instead of fighting him up at bantamweight, TJ Dillashaw did the moronic thing of coming down to flyweight to prove a point and, drained himself completely and got knocked out on the first good connection. Marlon Moraes was on an incredible streak. And I think that's probably one of Cejudo's not best fights in terms of best as a fighter. And believe me, when we're talking about GOAT, I think there's a big difference between best and GOAT, because GOAT, which I hate, but, the greatest and best is a big difference, because greatest is accomplishment. There are so many fighters you see, and, being in gyms your whole life, you're like, that dude's really good, and then nothing ever comes of him. But in MMA and in kickboxing and boxing, there's always these amazing fighters who just can't put it together. And, Henry Cejudo's performance against Marlon Moraes is not one of his best, but it is one of his greatest, because he gets the stuffing knocked out of him for the first round and a half, pours it on, has to basically wear Marlon Moraes' best punches and kicks and grinds through him. And then, of course, Marlon Moraes, by getting knocked out 7 times in a row after that, really does knock some of the shine off that too. And then Dominic Cruz was obviously ancient when he fought Henry Cejudo, even though Cejudo did completely have his number in a way that no one else really did. That was a great fight. The reads he made on Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz does this thing, I talked about it in several articles, but he'll bounce in on his left foot and then he'll bounce back into a very short stance with his right foot forward. So he's going in and out of stance all the time. And Cejudo would fake him so that he bounced back and then kick the leg that he left behind really well. People weren't doing that. And other stuff, corner him and he'd get him along the fence and kick the trailing leg. He was doing great things. But yeah, like I said, lots of asterisks in that great run. And I think with Alex Pereira, there are asterisks, but it's more like what he hasn't faced. Yes, he's not really faced anyone who's very good at taking people down. Jan Blachowicz has taken people down, and sometimes he's had impressive performances in the wrestling, but it's been against Luke Rockhold. He stuffed Luke Rockhold's takedowns when Luke Rockhold was a pretty strong wrestler, but Luke Rockhold was coming up a weight class, and he looked absolutely tiny next to Blachowicz. When Blachowicz fought Glover Teixeira, who Alex Pereira is training with every day, Glover Teixeira easily wrestled him onto the mat. And Glover Teixeira is a big, strong guy, but he doesn't have a lot of nuance to his wrestling. He's not a great technician. But then you ask yourself, Israel Adesanya was like the guy at middleweight just before Alex came. Well, I'm sorry, we're talking about Alex at light heavyweight now, but Israel Adesanya was a kickboxer, and the thing was always like, oh, but can he stop a double? And he fought Brunson, was probably the best wrestler he fought, and then Vettori maybe. And Vettori was a guy who came from kickboxing and just learned to wrestle because he couldn't hit hard enough to actually knock people out. Middleweight's a very weird weight class. There is just like up the top end, after people like Jacare and Joel Romero and stuff left, and even they were gravitating towards striking more than wrestling. There's not a lot of guys who will try and take you down and can do it effectively, and that's their game. There are lots of guys who come into a fight and decide that they've got to be the more rounded fighter and apply takedowns. But there aren't really many wrestling specialists. It was like Brunson, and that's it. And Brunson has all kinds of flaws, even when he's just going for a wrestling-only game plan. And at light heavyweight, not a tremendous amount of wrestlers there either. I mean, up at heavyweight, there's not a tremendous amount of wrestlers. It's like Curtis Blades, and then you've got guys like Jailton Almeida, who's not really a wrestler, but he's taking everyone down. It's not like lightweight, where there are guys who have come through the NCAA system or been through like the Russian wrestling system or have competed at a high level internationally. And this is like their second go-round. They've had their full wrestling career and now they're going in MMA. For some reason, there just isn't a lot of that at light heavyweight and middleweight. So you have to be fair to Alex Pereira, because if those people don't exist, we can't like shit on him for not fighting them. You can only fight who you're faced with. But then when you look at a lot of the fighters who are considered like the greatest ever, a lot of them is defined by their best opponents. Someone like Muhammad Ali in boxing, we know him for Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Sonny Liston. And even just below them, the next tier down is like Ken Norton, Ernie Shavers, really dangerous guys. Terrell, back in the early days. He fought a number of like all-time greats. I don't think Alex Pereira's opponents you look at and you go like, well, they would be a all-time great in their own right if it weren't for Alex Pereira. Maybe Adesanya because of his brilliant run at middleweight as champion. They're 1-1. There's a lot to be made of that. But like, who are we looking at on that list and going like, oh, all-time great candidate that Alex Pereira beat? But then, there's the same thing with Demetrius Johnson. A lot of his opponents weren't particularly special, but he consistently beat them, and he consistently beat them impressively, and that is all you can do. That's all you can be. He could have moved up and fought Dillashaw, but he'd already had a bantamweight career. And if you didn't see DJ's bantamweight career, he wasn't particularly special at bantamweight. He fought a declining Miguel Torres and got a very sketchy decision over him to even get the title shot against Dominic Cruz. So the going up in weight thing does add to your claim to being an all-time great. But again, it's something that falling into good matchups in the weight class above is a nice treat too, because a lot of these guys who get the double champion status, it's like, I won the belt in this weight class. I see that I could probably beat the champion in the weight class above. But a lot of them, you wouldn't give a great shot at like running through that division. So Alex Volkanovski, let's say Alex Volkanovski, around the time he fights Islam the first time, puts on one of the best performances against Islam Makhachev that anyone has. Looked pretty good, came on strong late, but even if he'd beaten Islam Makhachev that night, I don't think he'd have gone on to then beat every lightweight contender. I don't think he could have earned that title shot very easily. I think it would have been very hard for him as a featherweight coming up to fight, Dariush, Sarukian, people like that, and earn the title shot that way. It's a nice way to jump a queue. So it's like you get all the credit for beating all the best guys in two divisions, but you don't really do the two division thing. But then with Pereira, he's stuck around. He's fought three guys at light heavyweight who were top of the heap. So you got Blachowicz, Prochazka, and Hill. There's not an awful lot else for him. The people want the Ankalaev fight. He's talking about heavyweight, and everyone's sort of like, yeah, why not? Because light heavyweight is just so short on names and talent. I think with Pereira, a lot of people have just accepted that they don't want like title defenses. They don't want a long career. He's 37 years old. Might as well do the fun stuff and see when the wheels fall off. How big can he keep getting? How much further can he go up and still not look small? I suppose if he beats John Jones, that's a great name on his resume, as in like an all-time great name on his resume. But again, it's like John Jones we don't really know how good he is anymore because he's only fought once in the last 3 years and against a guy who, like, the moment he touched his legs, Cyril Gane just fell over. I think the thing with this, like a lot of things in fighting, it's how can we build a real image of you if you're not fighting that much? And the secret to being, having a successful fighting career is to, well, from an opponent standpoint, don't get seen that much. You don't want people having 25-minute fights of you to study through the film and learn from. You want to be bonking everyone in the first round if you can, and answer no questions, explain no further, and leave. Be Dorian Yates at the Olympia. Just don't do anything in between. Just turn up on the day and be absolutely massive and mog on people. But we as fight fans want to know you inside out. We want to know, can he do this? Can he do that? Can he fight going backwards? Can he fight in the pocket? And it's you want to build up this knowledge of people, and you want to give applause to the people who can do it all, but it doesn't help you as a fighter to show everything you've got. You really want to be like a load of question marks with a big left hook attached, which is what Alex Pereira is. I think it's kind of like the Rocky Marciano stuff. Rocky Marciano is going to be considered by a lot of people as an all-time great heavyweight, but he didn't really fight very many good fighters. The famous number is 49-0. That was what Mayweather was obsessed with. And it was like, I don't understand why, because you, Floyd Mayweather, have been fighting world champions and really elite competitions since like your 10th or 13th fight. Rocky Marciano didn't meet anyone decent until like 35 fights in. And even then, between then, he was going back to like the convention center in Boston and just knocking out nobodies in between. And then, all his best opponents, Jersey Joe Walcott, Ezard Charles, Archie Moore, Joe Louis, their average age is over 40. But you can only beat the people who are in front of you. He beat everyone he fought. He did it in the way that you're supposed to, impressively. When he had bad fights, he still pushed through and won them. I think the undefeated record for Marciano, there's a lot to be said for like what you place on the record. I don't particularly care about Rocky Marciano's undefeated record. I'm more impressed by the fact that like he walked through beatings by Ezard Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott and came back and won them. It wouldn't take much off his record if he lost one, because he was close to losing one at several points in his career. But for a lot of people, the O is the big thing. And that has become the big thing in boxing. It's threatening to become the big thing in MMA. If Habib Nurmagomedov had that Islam Makhachev loss where he got knocked out early on in like the first exchange of the fight, wouldn't change a thing for me. But for a lot of people, that is the big thing. I mean, Alex Pereira has 2 losses in MMA. He's got the famous Israel Adesanya one and his debut back in 2015 when he was working out if he could do this, and then he went straight back to kickboxing. But if you're talking about like overall greatest of all time stuff, I think you've always got to have a bias, or I'm always going to have a bias to lower weight classes, because there's just more talent there. The fighters are better at fighting. There aren't. Maybe they don't have the one-hit bonk power of a lot of these light heavyweights, but a lot of the guys at bantamweight and featherweight and lightweight and welterweight, no, maybe not welterweight, they're kind of shit too, but they can knock you out. And they've got wrestling and grappling, and also, go watch Tsarukian versus Makhachev. Just incredible level of fighting. And those 2 dudes were unranked at the time. So when you consider like level of competition and longevity and things like that, that's why people like Jose Aldo routinely come up in greatest of all time conversation, at least if you're talking to someone who knows anything about fighting, when most people in the world are like John Jones or George St. Pierre or Habib, maybe Anderson Silva. But again, like Anderson Silva, the end of his career, as in the portion of his career where he's just losing over and over again, that somehow allowed people to forget or take a shine off what he did when he was at his best, which is crazy. It shouldn't fucking matter. I mean, ultimately, I'm going to cop out and say it comes down to your criteria. I think there is an important place in history for him, in the young history of this sport, but winning the 2 titles, smoking the top guys at light heavyweight like he has, really been incredible, aside from Blachowicz, obviously. And if he goes up to heavyweight and wins a couple of fights there, that'll really be an impressive story. Who else has succeeded in 3 divisions? Maybe Frankie Edgar? But in MMA, where these divisions are so big. But like I said, he's 37. He's saying, like, I'm 37, I'm pretty old, in response to AJ saying he should box sometime today. But 37, the higher you go in weight, matters less. It's not like he's fighting bantamweights where slowing reactions are going to get him killed. And also he's got such a reputation that people don't want to get in his face. So all he has to do is sort of wave his left hook at them and they don't really want to get close. So there's a lot of time left for him to create some kind of all-time great career or a better case for one. But for me personally, I think I would be less concerned about like losses on the end of his career. If he took 3 knockout losses and retired, that doesn't really take the shine off people's career for me. If he fought like the first really good wrestler of his career and he was manhandled, that would make me sort of reassess him more than like a big decline in his skills. I think that stuff where people are like, oh, if you lose fights at the end of your career, it ruins your legacy. Look at BJ Penn, you know. I think that's moronic. But if he cannot defend the takedowns against elite grapplers and so on, that will make me reconsider like who he is and how good he is. Still good enough to knock out all these guys, but anyway, let's move on. I've taken forever on that question. I didn't mean to. Meme Shit Only asks, what did Usman Nurmagomedov pop for? I'm sorry, I can't tell you. If anyone has a press pass to one of these Bellator or PFL events, it's not like they're going to kick you out. It's not like the UFC where they'll be like, oh, you're blacklisted. Because they're desperate for people to bother covering their league. Just turn up with your microphone. Turn up, be one of 3 people there and be like, excuse me, can I ask about Mike Kogan's comments on Usman Nurmagomedov's drug use? And follow-up question, this tweet where he uses the N-word. Noiri Big Fan asks, can you just talk about K1 for an hour? I will, on the Boycast. Gabriel Haynes, Karate Combat legend Gabriel Haynes, asks, what's your favourite interview or podcast with a fighter? Favourite book about fighting? Favourite interview with a fighter? Do you know what? I really like some of those old American talk show episodes with boxers like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman. George Foreman, when he's in like the 1990s doing his comeback, he had some great TV appearances because he'd spent his young career like doing the Sonny Liston. He learned it from Sonny Liston, just being super surly with press and not wanting to talk. Loses the title to Muhammad Ali, does a load of weird shit like that night he fought 5 dudes in a row to try and prove a point. Ends up like in horrible depression and leaving the sport of boxing. Finds God, becomes a preacher, obviously works on his charisma a little bit from doing that. Decides he needs to make some money, comes back to boxing. And when you look back, he wasn't actually that old compared to like how old people are going and fighting now, but he looks old. And at the time it was like, he's 39 years old. He'll be murdered by these heavyweights. But he was doing chat shows and he was just it was so strange to see how likable he could be when in, watch footage of him in Zaire where he's the champion and Muhammad Ali is the underdog. And the people of Zaire have adopted Muhammad Ali as their guy. And there's one guy in it who goes, and then we saw George Foreman, and it turned out he was black, and we were really confused because we thought Muhammad Ali was the champion of black people. And then they just show a load of clips of George Foreman making social faux pas, like bringing his German Shepherd with him, which the Belgians used during the colonial period, and just saying weird stuff that was really sort of like trying too hard to be scary. But then you see George Foreman on with like Johnny Carson in the 90s, and he's hilarious and he's self-effacing. And Johnny Carson asked him like, "Was there anyone you were ever scared of?" And he said, "Yeah, I used to stare people down, and then I fought Joe Frazier, and I was staring him down before the fight, and I'm glad he didn't look down because he'd have seen my knees were shaking." And he says, "I really wanted to be heavyweight champion of the world, but I really hoped that Joe Frazier would die." Really good interview. There was a good interview with not a fighter, but Brendan Ingle did a great interview with the guy from Countdown way back in the 90s. And it was, probably actually early 2000s. And he was talking about like his method of coaching. This was just after Prince Nazim had left him. And if any interview you see with Ray Arcel is really interesting. Not a boxer or a trainer, but Bundini. He was a card. If you ever see any interview footage of him, came up with Float Like a Butterfly, Sting Like a Bee, and Rumble Young Man Rumble. I suppose we better do some MMA ones. I will say, Conor McGregor, I never found him like to be the amazing wit that everyone seemed to think he was when he was saying things like, I'll rest my balls on your head. But he was very charismatic, and what I appreciated about him people got a little bit mad about the woo-woo bullshit about movement and expressing the human body and so on. But when you watch those earlier interviews with him, he does seem genuinely extremely passionate about martial arts and willing to sort of study any kind of martial art. There's clips of him trying capoeira. He had this weird taekwondo style, which he learned from a guy who was teaching at Straight Blast Gym and ended up in prison from like knocking a guy out in a street fight, and he banged the back of his head on the pavement, which is really, that's a story you hear far too much. Be real careful if you get in street fights. If you feel yourself hit someone on the jaw, you need to leap into action like one of those Thai refs and catch the back of their head before it bounces off the pavement. But I remember going to some event, it might have been like a Cage Warriors thing, actually. But I remember going to some event, and I was backstage, and I walked past what turned out to be Conor McGregor. And this was into his UFC run. He was already famous. And he was talking to a number of people. I just didn't really clock who he was. And, of course, everyone looks bigger on TV, and he's quite a small guy, so I just sort of walked past him. And what I do remember is that, like, even into his being very successful in the UFC, he was at an event, like, he was at an event supporting his mates, and he was still making himself very available to media in a sort of informal way and just being there so that people could talk to him, which I thought was interesting. But it used to be that you'd scour the internet for footage of Fedor giving interviews, because not only is he very soft-spoken and quiet and does not say a lot did not used to say a lot when people asked him questions, it also came through that layer of translation as well. It was like, it's like when you read A Movable Feast and they're all these writers are talking about getting a good translation of Tolstoy and how the current translation is not good enough, and they won't read it until there's a better translation that does justice to the words. And that's what it was like trying to work out what Fedor was saying. And people would say, like, oh, they translated it wrong. He had this woman who was like his chosen translator, must be like a friend or a friend of the family. And she'd come around and they'd say, like, oh, well, who was your hardest opponent, Fedor? And he'd say a load of stuff, and then she'd go, oh yeah, Kevin Randlebaum was a tough one. Johnny Flintbike. It's like, these aren't people. What are the names that you're translating? That was always the accusation with Ed Suarez, the guy who was Anderson Silva's manager to a number of Brazilian fighters in the UFC, and he would do his own translations for his fighters at the end of fights and post-fight interviews. And people would always say he left a lot off of what they said. But then I'm sure there's plenty of fighters who wish they did have someone like editing their post-fight interview when they might be concussed. Best book on fighting, The Fight, Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer wrote a lot of crap, but The Fight is a very good book. There's also a great book called Notorious by Jack Slack. Christopher says, favourite instructional of 2024 so far? I think probably Taylor Perman, who won the Euro trials. He put out a leg attack DVD, not DVD, instructional, you know what it is. I think it's on it's Fanatics, that one. The thing about jiu-jitsu at the moment is you try and keep it's one of those, the thing about jiu-jitsu that's makes it such a weird sport is that you need to be, it's kind of like a competitive video game, you need to be up on the meta. It's changing so quickly. And leg lock stuff is really like the cutting edge of that. But it's been a while since like new developments in the leg lock game really caught me and maybe go, oh my God, I need to change that. You'll occasionally see, like, I get it from matches mainly, things that Mikey Musumici's doing, or Nicky Ryan or Joseph Chen. You'll be watching closely and you go, oh, that's a cool thing, I'm stealing that. Like Gordon Ryan, I used to watch him do things, and there were things that I spotted him doing years before I started talking about them because I wanted to steal them. I've never done that with striking stuff, but Gordon Ryan, when he was using high step passing for the very first few times, when he was using the high risk guillotine and no one had noticed, I was fucking working on those in the gym and I was still terrible at them. I was like, I can't tell anyone because I'm not saying I'll make it catch on, but I'll be helping it catch on. Another one he does right now that people haven't really picked up on is the double shin on shin position, where he removes the top foot and he does a little foot sweep and moves to the back. He did it against Phil Rowe. Yeah, that's something that I'm working on too, but have that one for free. But yeah, Taylor Perman's instructional really made me go, oh, wow. And I'm guilty of not having watched the Euro trials before I saw the instructional. And I was like, oh, okay, because BJJ Fanatics let me watch things and then I tell you if anything's really good. And I was so impressed with the stuff he was showing that I had to go and watch his trials performance. And I was like, oh my God, this dude's got some really cool ideas. Other stuff. Someone showed me that there's a website. I think it's some All Stars Judo, All Stars Judo, or some kind of judo website. It might be Neil Adams's judo website, but someone gave me a pen drive with the Mongolian judo team on it, and their techniques in that are really cool because the Mongolian pickup is something that you see in sumo all the time, and Mongolia apparently has exploded onto the judo world in the last few years. And they're changing the rules to try and stop Mongolians picking people up, but they're still doing it. But that was really impressive. So I don't know where you find that, but just look up Mongolian judo instructional online. Trying to think of what else has really impressed me. Oh, Submeta. Lachlan Giles' whole website is fantastic. I think that's probably one of the best resources in grappling at the moment. Gary Tonin had an interesting instructional on heisting in general. I quite like that now. People doing sort of a study on a concept or a position. The things that don't get me excited are when someone's done like top game mastery or bottom, how to play the guard or whatever. Or there are still people who are just doing instructionals that's like, one section's my top game, one section's my bottom game, one section's my passing, one section's my escapes. It's like, no, just pick something you're really good at and do a detailed study of it. Gerald Meerschaert put out a really interesting back taking/finishing instructional, which I haven't watched all of yet, but I've heard other people talk highly of it. I was quite enjoying Bia Mesquita's no-gi guard stuff. Then I rewatched her match with Fionn at ADCC a couple of years ago, and she's doing a lot of stuff in it there. She almost gets an armbar off, a very cool little thing, where she gives the opponent her wrist and then uses that to pull their arm forward and throw up a top lock on the corner and throw up a top lock on their shoulder to start moving into an armbar from bottom closed guard. Because armbars from bottom closed guard are so hard to do unless you really trick the opponent. And I think that's the interesting thing. That's what people are learning through the leg lock stuff, is how to hide things, how to trick people into stuff. And I think that's the real high level of jiu-jitsu that you sort of miss a lot of the time. If you're just rolling and you're not really thinking about it, you're going from position to position, you're flowing, but you're not really tricking people as much as you should be. Also, Mike Perez just qualified for ADCC in the heavyweight division, despite being a very small guy. But his YouTube is full of clips of him doing wrist locks and teaching wrist locks. And honestly, watching Mike Perez, he's okay as a competitor. I mean, he's like a world-class competitor, but among world-class competitors, he's pretty ho-hum. He doesn't do a lot of special stuff, but he does bang this wrist lock on once in every tournament, and he does it against good guys like Kieran Kachuk. And he almost caught Gordon Ryan with it in 2015. Oh, and he did it to Craig Jones and swept him off it. And that's with wrist locks, which are like a bullshit technique. So definitely go check that out because his YouTube stuff is free. Also, Rafa Mendes released a big instructional on the armbar on BJJ Fanatics. And I know he's got his own site. I haven't been on his site in years, but his thing on the armbar, which is again like a positional study, well, not a positional study, it's a technical study of the armbar from many different positions. Really, really good. Some really creative stuff in there. And it's Rafa Mendes, so there's anything he shows, there's like 5 clips of him doing it to people in rolling or competition. I don't think I talk about Rafa Mendes enough. He's really incredible. I mean, he's possibly the GOAT in grappling. Gi and no gi. And I'm always shouting it out on the podcast, but Sylvie's Muay Thai library project is well worth your time. She goes around talking to legends of Muay Thai and some contemporary guys as well, and just getting them to teach stuff. And some of them you're watching and you're going like, I'm not getting a lot from this. And then another time you'll put on one and you just go, oh, gem after gem. Because when you got that many trainers and coaches and teachers together, one of them is going to click with you. And it might be their teaching style. It might be something they're showing, being part of your game already and you learning a bit more about it. But there's been a couple of those episodes. I mean, there's been like 140 episodes of it, but there's been a couple where I really just came away thinking, damn, I've got a new perspective on a lot of things in striking, which is rare when you've been doing this for like 20-something years. Or technical question. Donnie says, methods for dealing with front kicks and fighting long behind those kinds of weapons, i.e. Volkov's recent fight. Okay, for fighting behind those weapons, I think you need to vary your targets is an important one. So if you watch like a top Thai using the teep well, they'll go, it's not all like solar plexus, which coming from like a kickboxing or karate or any sort of like hit the person hard background, you will focus on hitting the stuff that hurts a lot. But they'll bring it off to the side, maybe poke it under the floating ribs. Skarbowski used to talk about kicking the bladder, which is kind of like you have to kick the belt line, basically. But they'll do thighs, they'll do the hip joint. If you can get away with it, it's a good kick. Top of the thigh, middle of the thigh, bottom of the thigh, under the knee occasionally. But just having all these places that you can push someone away or push someone back and break their rhythm briefly, and then just work on picking your knee up and dropping down into a boxing stance. That's one of the big secrets. We talked about it with Max Holloway a little while ago. Start in a shorter stance, pick your knee up, put it down in a boxing stance and start boxing, because that's the way you land. Same with side kicks, which means that you have to sort of, because you're going to be starting side on, you pick your leg up and then you put it down slightly off to the side so that when you land, you're in a good boxing stance ready to throw both hands. Dealing with them, if you're in a pure kickboxing or Muay Thai contest, you can draw them out and parry them. Just fake as if you're coming in. They'll pick up their leg and try and teep you. You bat it offline and come in behind it. You can also do what Stephen Thompson did to Jorge Masvidal every time he picked up his lead leg. He faked to come in, took a little bounce off to the right, and then came in again. Or if you're happy, like with your balance generally, you can do like what's called sometimes a leg hooking block. Or I suppose it's kind of like a check, but pick your leg up as if you're going to teep, but bring it from outside of your body to inside your body so that your shin knocks their teep offline or their front kick offline, and step in after it. It does help being able to fight out of both stances to do that, because if you use your right leg to knock their leg offline, you want to be able to step through into southpaw and start hitting them. Or do the old Sanshao catch, one hand above, one hand below, grab the heel and the top of the foot, and you can do that Islam Makhachev style, big swing, knock them off their feet. Anytime you catch or counter a kick, it makes people reconsider doing it. I think the most important thing with any kind of weapon that you want to dissuade the opponent from using is to try and punish them for it. You might not even successfully punish them, but as long as they go, oh, don't want him doing that again, they'll stop throwing it. The real problem is like taking the teep or taking the kick on the front of the knee, batting it offline and not really threatening them at all. Steopich says, signs of a fighter being over the hill and ways they can resist the sands of time, a la George Foreman. Signs of being over the hill, taking punches that they probably wouldn't have in their best days. I would say that there's a difference here, because if you're taking punches and you're still taking them well, it normally means you can see them coming. You're just not physically fast enough to move out of the way. If they're taking punches that they wouldn't previously take and they're getting rattled by them, that's a lot worse, because it means that they're probably not seeing them coming. They're not making those little adjustments like just clenching the jaw, tightening up the neck, the stuff that you do naturally. If you're not able to make those small adjustments that you should make if something's going wrong, then you definitely aren't seeing them coming. I think the eyes are a big part of the fight, but you can even overcome your eyes slowing down by making fights grindier. With Foreman, the cross guard did him a lot of favors. Having a guard that he could get close in behind, not take really many shots to the key areas, the really dangerous stuff that would knock him out or lead to a knockout. And he was obviously helped by having enormous power, but in MMA, using the clinch is really important. Being able to barrel into the clinch, being able to throw your punches and into the clinch and then break with a good elbow or whatever, that will carry you a really long way. I always reference Big Nog. His later fights, he was pretty hit and miss. He was like 2-2. But once he started working on that cage boxing stuff, watch his second fight with Mir. He does get, obviously, Kimura'd in that fight, but he kicks the shit out of Mir on the feet. And Mir is a lot faster than him, as he'd shown in the first fight. It's just that Big Nog's entering behind a good punch, pressing him to the fence, and then breaking away and punching him again and then burying his head back in Mir's chest. He roughs him up. Crafty, with a picture of John Morgan asking a question, says, what do you think about Rei Tsuruya and how far do you think he could go in the UFC? Little bit of a question mark over his striking. Also, in his last fight, he got into like a grappling, exchanging sort of fight. A lot of the time when you see like a really strong wrestler with some grappling chops, it's like they get the good position and they hold the good position and they punish the guy. And he's a little bit, possibly even too flowy. I like watching guys work and experiment with position, but he was just all over the place in that fight. And it makes you wonder, when you watch an Islam Makhachev, which is, of course, we're talking about like the gold standard in a completely different division, but if you give him an inch, he drops his weight on it and goes, right, you're not having that back. Oh, you've given me another inch. It's just, I felt like that Tsuruya fight, he was having a lot of fun, it looked like, and to be a really top-level grappler in MMA, you probably don't need to be having fun. You need to be just smothering the guy, making him panic, punishing him for everything he does, and not having fun Sakuraba versus Newton type, we're having a great time exchanges. Also, really liked that belly-to-belly suplex he did in the first or second round. Did not like that he did it again and pulled the guy into mount, which is like, that is, yes, you're good enough to dig yourself out of the hole. No, you don't want to be doing that against guys who are close to your level, which you will eventually meet, unless you're just God tier and there's no one who's ever going to be that close. Even John Jones stopped doing wild things because he started fighting better opposition. He wasn't doing, if you watch his fight with Bonner, he's just going mental the whole time. Then when you watch him fight someone like Rashad or whoever, or even Rampage, it's a lot more methodical because he wants to win more than he wants to put on a show. Pavka asks, do you think the Valeri kick and the ashi-barai would ever be applied in MMA? You see the odd, you see people axe kicking the thigh from the clinch. The Valeri kick's more like a weird sort of crescent-y kick when you see Valeri himself do it. It's an axe kick to the lower, it's an axe kick to the thigh but thrown round. Just look it up. Valeri kick, which I hope I don't have to spell. But I like it because checking isn't as common in karate. In some types of knockdown karate, checking's banned even. I think it's the, is it Shin Kyokushin or is it Shirinji Kempo? But a lot of guys just stay there and take the kick anyway to be in better position to hit the body with their hands. But I also like that if you throw that kick against someone who's checking, you're probably not going to hurt yourself as badly as if you hit the shin on shin. If you hit heel on shin, you've got a good chance of just bruising them, but you've also got a good chance of just not really anything happening. And I always like kicks that let you kick hard with less concern about getting injured yourself. Ashi-barai, I think one of the things that stops it being applied in like a judo sense in MMA is that there's not an awful lot of like moving around from the clinch out in the open. If you go to like a grappling session, you're an open mat or whatever, and you grapple no-gi with a good judoka, they'll be able to move you around and they'll be able to sweep you and stuff. Doesn't happen as much in MMA because you get pushed against the fence and then you need movement to happen to time the ashi-barai. The karate style ashi-barai, which I think Lyoto Machida is probably the most famous for using in MMA, but I always like that little hook of the foot as you retreat from your stance. So if you're southpaw and they're orthodox, you step outside their lead leg, you throw your left hand. As you come back, you pull out of the exchange, you lean back, pull your front foot back with you, hooking it at the ankle behind their heel, and you just pull their foot forward. And always with these things, it's like if you pull it in the line of their toes, towards their toes, that is, their foot will probably just slide, even on a mat. So that works really well. And in point karate styles, that's a big thing to like throw your punch, pull back when it doesn't score. You throw your punch, you pull back, you pull their lead leg, and you throw a high kick as they're off balance. So I'd love to see more of that. I think it'd be more feasible in MMA than it would in sports where people are ready to get on one leg to check the kicks. Sports where people plant their feet and want to swing, that's where you get your foot sweeps. Oh, Div says, is Gregor Gillespie the greatest what if in MMA history? What if he hadn't started his career at age 27? He's always going to be a big what if, but I think with Gillespie, it's such a competitive division. It's not like someone like Gable Stevenson, who just dominated heavyweight wrestling in NCAA at least. And he spent 3 or 4 years fucking around because he's got he tried to do WWE. I think he's trying to make an NFL team now, which we look at and we go like, you're wasting your physical prime and there is a sport that's tailor-made for you. But if you could get NFL bench warmer money, it's better than MMA top 5 ranked money. Though Sidikov is supposed to be coming over to MMA soon, allegedly. But I will say Gillespie is a sad one that it worked out the way it did. He was sort of thrown off by the knockout from Kevin Lee. Really amazing knockout. I haven't watched that one in a while, but it's crystal clear in my head. He had the fight with Carlos Diego Ferreira in 2021. Jesus, that's so long ago. And there's nothing on his Wikipedia page saying he's retired or anything. He is 37. But I think with Gillespie, this is the thing with everything right now. If the UFC had actually taken the McGregor stuff and run with it, we would have a dozen Peyton Talbots in the UFC right now. There is so little financial incentive for anyone to try this sport, even if they come from something like wrestling, where they were making no money and they're uniquely qualified to fight in MMA. It's not feasible to be like top 20 in the world and still make a good amount of money. I mean, it's totally feasible. It would just involve the UFC not having as big margins. But it's the case where like these talented wrestlers, if they can do anything else, they do something else. And it's not just the UFC, obviously. I'm blaming the UFC because this is Gillespie. And also because they have so much money. They are succeeding. they could throw some more money to the peasants and it wouldn't hurt them at all. But another example of this is like Cole Conrad. He was Bellator's heavyweight champion. He was a Div 1 champion 2006, 2007. Jesus, his Wikipedia has just like 2 pages of accomplishments. But he was undefeated in MMA, and then he just retired to sell milk futures because he thought that that has a future more than MMA does. And apparently he still trains, because when Brock Lesnar was getting really seriously into the UFC, and I think for his comeback as well against Mark Hunt, he was like, get me Cole Conrad. And Cole Conrad turned up, and there's a great photo of him and Lesnar in the biggest gis you've ever seen with blue belts on. But, you know, he didn't have the most exciting fights all the time, but he was a super talent. To have that talented a wrestler at that size, undefeated in MMA, Bellator's heavyweight champion, be like, this isn't worth it, and go and do a pretty, you know, a normal office job, points out how insane the money stuff in this sport is. Because he wouldn't have not been on the UFC's radar. They probably would have had an offer for him at the end of his Bellator contract, or in anticipation of the end of his Bellator contract. And if they weren't touching, you know, something that made him feel safer than being a commodities broker, it really tells you something. But this was 2012. I mean, it's still the case now. They're just not putting the money back into the sport. They're taking it out and not reinvesting. Matty says, what do you think the next big leap in MMA technique is going to be? E.g. cage wrestling, calf kicking. I said the left hook a while ago, and now we've got a champion who's just like bonk left hook. 2-division champion, no less. Possible GOAT. I think elbows. I think clinch breaks and clinch striking need to be a bigger thing. I was just watching Okrayun in 1, and he's fighting this Russian lad who's got wins over other top Russian lads like Nurmagomedov as an amateur. Undefeated. Okrayun's backing himself onto the ropes, because this is the ring, letting this guy clinch up with him, and then he'll throw an elbow and dig an underhook. And he does it about 50 times in this fight, and he doesn't hurt the guy, and the guy's face is like unmarked. But for a little while, Leon Edwards was just murking people with elbows on the break and elbows in the clinch. It needs to be studied better. There should be people, you know, Muay Thai has its elbow fighters. There are guys who just do elbows. This and Muay Thai are the only sports where elbows are legal. We need some fucking elbow fighters in MMA. Robin says, if you were put in some level of power at PFLator, what would you... Love that name. What would be the moves you'd be making to improve things? This is the thing. The $1 million tournament is a good thing for attention or marketing-wise, because all you know about PFL is that they have $1 million tournament. They have $1 million prize. Granted, that when you get into it, there's levels of bullshit to it, as in like they top up your fight purses to $1 million. You don't get your fight purses and then you get $1 million for winning. But people know it. That's all they know about PFL. That being said, it sucks. It doesn't work. It means that they have to do 2 weight classes per event. They have to get 3 events out of the way quickly. And then they have to do 6 weeks break. And then they have to do 3 weeks of events, all on different nights of the week for some reason. It makes their schedule really fucking weird. They banned elbows because they don't want people getting cut in a way that the commission wouldn't license them for the next fight in a couple of months. And it also means that like you get weird fights that one fighter is going to get so much more for winning than the other. So you get fights like Linton Vassell was fighting Moldavsky the other day. And Linton Vassell's a legend, so he went out there to win. But Linton Vassell wasn't going to continue in the tournament even if he won, because of how the points worked out. Moldavsky could win and could continue in the tournament. Not only are you sort of like demotivating some of your fighters by making them continue in this tournament, even if they're not going to win, you're also creating a big motivation to, you know, collaborate and cheat to win $1 million. I think the other thing that really annoys me is keeping Bellator as a separate brand, because they don't have enough fighters that they can do them regularly. So like the next Bellator event is September, I think. And they're called Bellator Champion Series. The first one had 3 of their champs on. The last one had none of their champs on. It's just really fucking stupid. For me, I'm ditching the Bellator brand generally. I'm calling it PFL, which is probably a less known brand than Bellator, to be honest. But keep it as PFL. Bring all the Bellator fighters into the fold. Ditch the tournament or do smaller tournaments, so 4 fighters in the tournament and run it over 2 events. And the rest of the time, just have them fighting, to advance or fall back in the division. If you had a UFC tournament with the top 4 guys at lightweight who aren't Islam Makhachev, that would be the hypest thing happening in MMA that year. So I'd say take the top 4 guys of each weight class, kind of like K1 did with their whatever division Kaneko and Kimura are in. But just 4-man tournament, but the best guys. Only takes 2 events, only takes max 6 months, and it'll be the hypest shit in the world. And you've also got much less scope for things going wrong. Keep the $1 million prize and give the winner a title shot. Have the champion smash some bum in the meantime. Classic Scott Coker move. And I said it a while ago, but with the UFC having sort of a stumble with the knockout ratio since the gloves came in, I would be like PFL home of the knockout. Because currently their branding is PFL, the toughest tournament in MMA, just got tougher. And the one question I have when I read that is, did the prize money go up, or are we just like suffering from inflation here? What's going on? Hard Goddard says, will someone ever get a mother's milk submission in MMA? Or what is your take on mother's milk and its efficiency in modern no-gi grappling? Mother's milk is where you get on top of the guy and you smush your tits into his mouth and nose, his breathing holes. And guys have been tapped by that. Luke Griffith tapped some guy with that a couple of months ago. I think any smother, the thing about the mount smother is that you can actually make it harder to get away from. But smothers are just things to make stuff happen. I was watching Tairu Atolo versus Joseph Chen earlier today. Chen's entering on a K-guard. He's starting to attack a leg. They're sort of stuck in a middle position, and Tairu Atolo can't really move without taking weight off his leg and letting Chen enter it. So he grabs a hold of Chen's head on one side and just puts his mouth over Chen's mouth. Hand over his mouth. They don't smooch. Great move in a no-gi match. You just grab their head and you pash them. Now he puts his hand over Chen's mouth. And you're looking at it going, well, Chen would be an idiot to get submitted by that. But it does mean that Chen has to move his hands to do something. And if you're locked in a stalemate position, anytime you make them move one limb, you've got something. You've made an improvement. But I think mother's milk is really helped by having some piece of cloth to put over the opponent's face. So rash guard, and if you're doing fucking Magid Haj big t-shirt, either of those get covered in sweat, put them on the opponent's mouth and nose. That makes it a lot harder for them, and you've got a better chance of submitting them. If you're a big fat guy like Emmanuel Yarbrough, he won a fight by smother, but I don't know how viable it is in MMA. What it does in no-gi is that it serves the purpose of making people move, which is something you can do in MMA by simply hitting them, which is obviously much more preferable. Social Blunderer says, how do you feel about the ecological/constraints-based approach to learning martial arts? Seems to be gaining traction in BJJ, but haven't heard of many striking coaches using it. This is interesting. Like, lots of my friends are doing ecological type training at the moment, and I've had a few sessions of it, and I do think games-based approaches to things are always interesting, because you've got to remember, like, the revelation of judo and BJJ is that Kano took the techniques of various jiu-jitsu styles, took away the stuff that he thought was too dangerous to practice day to day, and then just sparred loads. And his school became really good by doing loads of sparring. And it's like, yeah, we could have those techniques in, but we think we're probably safer without them in. But we're getting really good at dealing with a live opponent going back and forth. So even that has its constraints, and just by doing loads and loads of it, you get really good at fighting generally. Maybe not the striking part, but you know what I mean. I think the ecological constraint stuff in jiu-jitsu is a lot more specific. There's a lot more specificity, sorry. Oh God, what's his name? Can't remember his name. The guy who is famous for it, he has a couple of, I think, world champs at the coloured belt levels in BJJ now. He's got some interesting ideas. When he explains it, he does talk a lot. Like, it's very wordy, which I think appeals to the sort of Danaher type people who want BJJ to be a science as much as it is like a athletic pursuit. But I do think there's a lot of merit to the idea. And I think the way that it makes you think is very useful too, because a lot of the big leaps in like jiu-jitsu meta or technique or whatever have been just some random guy going, well, what happens if I do this to this arm or this to this foot? What happens if I remove this little bit of control that he's got here? Attacking something that like you would not consider on the surface level of the position or the technique, and finding out that it breaks the technique for the opponent, or it makes it more easy, or it improves your position or whatever. And by setting constraints, like the one that I've seen a lot of is supine guard play, working to get 2 feet inside the opponent and control of both ankles. You could teach someone how to pummel their legs, but ultimately what matters is getting their legs into the right position. And they might even invent some clever new way of getting their leg in while the opponent's resisting. So it does, I think it's really interesting. I think there are extremes of it where there's people who say, like, I don't teach technique or whatever. And I think that's kind of like, well, I suppose the experiment is how far can you get your students with just the ecological method. But half the fun for me of jiu-jitsu is like watching someone do something and then stealing it. That's the fun of any martial art for me. But in terms of applying it to striking, I was watching their Ecological Palooza or whatever it is on YouTube. There was a big seminar with a few guys, and there was an MMA coach there. I didn't finish watching his seminar yet, but there are people trying to do it. I think striking is interesting because I think you've got some thinking to do to get the constraints on striking. But, you know, people have always played games like just low kicks, or this person just sets up their right kick, that person just sets up their left kick. At the base of it, it all comes down to familiarity. You know, whether you're naming positions or you're just explaining the goal and going over it, you know, and teaching the people to get to it and how to deal with someone fighting to stop you from getting to it. It's familiarity. And I brought this up when I was talking about Quinton Jackson earlier this week in my article about Osaki versus Mandakuro, which you should definitely read. And I've gone like an hour into the pod without plugging it. But Quinton Jackson and Dustin Poirier are two examples of very different styles. Dustin Poirier likes his shoulder roll, his high shoulders, his high lead elbow. Quinton Jackson liked putting on the you know, answering the telephone, really high elbow stuff, crazy monkey stuff. But both of them found a way of blocking that allowed them to stand in range of the opponent when they were punching. And both of them got comfy under fire, or were more comfortable under fire. And that accelerated their learning in the striking portion of the fight. So with trying to learn striking ecologically, you've got to try and set up a way of making people comfortable in like striking positions without them just getting brained all the time and taking brain damage. Obviously, you could tell them to limit the power on their strikes and things, but once you get into situations where people are poking each other in the face with big gloves on, it's very hard to control that level of intensity, especially for beginners and newer students. But that's when I think about things like Winkerbank Gym. They used to do loads of body sparring. And if you just do body sparring like Kyokushin, where you're just specifically focusing on the body like it's the only legal target, you sort of lose the boxing aspect and it becomes trading hands in range. But if you say, right, instead of jabbing, we're jabbing to the chest or jabbing to the shoulders. If instead of left hooking to the head, we're left hooking to the lead shoulder, to the inside of it. Then you can start getting loads and loads of rounds in without getting that badly lumped up or suffering brain damage. And that's an interesting game. But yeah, there's so much to the ecological approach, and they're very strict on policing how the term is used. So I'm sure that many of the things that I've said here are not going to conform to the ecological approach. It's quite, there has to be a game and a goal, and both people have to be working towards their own goal. And it's, you know, if you've got time, go and listen to one of them talk about it. But I think the key with everything, and you know, it's the James Toney paradigm or dilemma. The more rounds of sparring you get in, the better you get at fighting. But the more rounds of sparring you get in, particularly with striking, the more you get injured and the more it takes out of you. So any effort to find ways to do that with decent intensity, but with reduced wear and tear, is probably where the martial arts need to go. A lot of them end up going in the opposite direction, where they just are scared of sparring, and then, are you really even doing martial arts anymore? Pillar of Wamu asks, what is your Elden Ring build? I'm trying to get 60 in everything, because I believe that's when you get diminishing returns on stats, isn't it? But right now I'm using the Blasphemous Blade, the big fingerprint shield, and the armor's just whatever. Whatever doesn't make me heavy roll after that. Right, I've prattled on for ages. If you haven't read it, there's a Kazuki Osaki versus Jin Mandakuro short study on the Patreon. It's a fun fight. Osaki has this really interesting high guard with the very high elbows. Mandakuro did some interesting hand traps and guard manipulation, and he invented a weird low kick that looks like a knee and then turns over. Doesn't have a lot of power, but it does score points. If you want to get that and the Boycast later this week, where I talk about K1 and One Championship, sign up to the Patreon. Support the podcast. Be a boy. If you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. And if you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy, Jack Slack. Yuki Oza did it again. Bless.